The night begins slowly like a deep breath taken by the earth. The air moves softly through empty fields, over quiet rivers, and into forgotten rooms where time seems to rest. In this stillness, the mind also finds its place, not as a thing to fix, but as something to observe, like water in a bowl, shifting gently with the movement of the air. Before there were words for anxiety, before there were doctors for the mind, there was only the simple understanding that calm could break, and that when it did, life became heavier. People did not speak of mental health, they spoke of humors, of balance, of light and shadow within the body. They looked to the sky, to plants, to silence itself for answers. In medieval towns, as fires burned low and the sound of carts faded, the world grew small and personal. The body and the mind were seen as one. What troubled the blood could trouble the heart, and what cooled the breath could quiet thought. When sadness came, people did not name it. They waited, they worked, they changed what they could touch. The rhythm of survival was its own medicine. This journey you are about to take is not of science or diagnosis. It is a walk through a slower world, one of candles and herbs, of moonlight and quiet theories, a world that did not yet separate feeling from flesh or thought from the air it moved through. Here, care is not found in words but in gestures, a hand passing a cup of tea, a door closing softly, a bowl of warm broth left beside a bed. For the next 90 minutes we will drift through this forgotten landscape, through the humors and the healers, through silence and strange remedies, through the slow awakening of reason. Each part will unfold like breath, steady and calm, guiding you through the old understanding of the mind. You do not need to remember the names, or the methods, or the time. You only need to listen, to let the weight of the world ease a little, and to rest in the quiet truth that even centuries ago people were already trying, in their own small ways, to make peace with the restless heart. The four humors. In the quiet beginning of the old world, when knowledge was still woven from the threads of instinct and wonder, medicine was not a science, but a belief that life itself was a fragile balance, and that within every human being there flowed four invisible rivers: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. These were not just fluids, but forces, temperaments, moods, and elements of being. They moved like seasons through the body, shifting with age, weather, and emotion. When they were in harmony, the spirit was calm, thought was clear, and the heart steady. But when one began to overflow, when the inner rivers grew wild or stagnant, everything in a person's nature could change. A man once kind could turn sullen and bitter. A woman once joyful could sink into silence. The doctors of that age did not call it illness of the mind, they called it imbalance. The quiet war between the humors. Each humor had its own nature, its own temperature, its own temperament. Blood was warm and moist, the essence of vitality, the color of youth and courage. It made a person generous, passionate, full of laughter and appetite. Too much of it, however, could make one impulsive, too eager, too alive. Yellow bile was hot and dry, the spark of anger and will, giving energy and sharpness, but in excess it burned too brightly, consuming reason. Black bile was cold and dry, heavy and deep, the shadow of melancholy. It belonged to thinkers, poets and mourners, giving depth and reflection. Yet when it rose too high, it drowned the soul in sadness. And phlegm, cool and wet, brought calmness, patience and stillness, though when it thickened, it weighed the body down, turning movement into slowness and thought into fog. In this fragile balance of elements lay the explanation for every mood, every sickness, every mystery of the body and mind. When someone grew anxious, it was the heat of bile. When they laughed too much, it was an excess of blood. When they withdrew into silence, it was the rise of black bile. Nothing was random. The stars, the weather, the foods one ate, all were said to guide the flow of these humours, to tilt the scale of being. Physicians of the Middle Ages watched these signs with quiet patience. They touched the wrist, studied the colour of the eyes, the pulse, the heat of the skin. Diagnosis was not about what was broken, but what had lost its balance. Treatment, too, was an art of rebalancing. To cool the body, they drained blood. To warm it, they prescribed wine and spices. If one was sluggish, they recommended garlic, pepper, and movement. If one was angry or restless, they gave cucumber water, gentle herbs, or sleep near running water. The body was like a vessel of air and tide, and the task of the healer was to calm its storms, to restore its still surface. Sometimes they used leeches to remove excess vitality, believing that health returned when the red flow lessened. Sometimes they purged the stomach with bitter herbs to drive out the weight of melancholy. The process was slow, careful, patient, for the healer's true craft was observation. To these early physicians, sadness was not an invisible thing of thought or spirit. It was tangible, physical, something that could be touched, bled, or soothed. They believed that sorrow collected somewhere deep, thickening like dark water in the veins. When they cut the arm and watched the blood flow, they saw not just red, but release, the draining away of heaviness. And when the wound was closed, they believed the mind would breathe again. The act may seem cruel now, but in their eyes it was mercy. To restore balance was to restore life. Across villages and small towns, this idea shaped every household. A mother adjusting her family's meals for the season, avoiding heat in summer, adding spice in winter. She was practicing medicine. A farmer who rose with dawn to walk before work believed the morning air cleared the phlegm. A servant who laughed too loudly at night might be warned that his blood was rising. The language of the four humours entered everything: behaviour, emotion, even art. A painter would speak of melancholy blues and choleric yellows, of sanguine reds and phlegmatic whites. In this way, medicine was not separate from life. It was life, studied through colour, warmth, and the movement of air. There were no hospitals as we know them now, no separation of body and mind. A healer could be a doctor, a barber, or a wise neighbour. The instruments were simple: a basin, a cloth, a cup of herbs. Remedies were slow and sensory. Warm compresses, gentle massage, time in sunlight, the smell of rosemary for memory, or lavender for calm. To them the body was a garden, and healing was the tending of soil and seed. They spoke often of temperament, the balance between hot and cold, wet and dry. Each person was a unique mix of these qualities, and illness came when one side overpowered the other. When people spoke of temperament, they spoke of character too. A sanguine man was joyful and warm, a choleric woman fiery and bold, a melancholic poet deep and solitary, a phlegmatic elder patient and slow. Health was harmony among these natures, and when one grew too strong, it was not shame, but condition. They did not yet know the word depression, but they knew what it meant to feel heavy, to lose colour, to drift apart from the rhythm of others. They treated it not with judgment, but with small adjustments: less meat, more rest, softer music, open windows. Every act of care was a kind of listening to the body, to the pulse, to the quiet between breaths. A physician of that time might not have cured disease as we understand it, but he carried a rare patience. He waited, he observed, he saw not symptoms but seasons within a single person. And though his tools were crude, his intention was clear: to bring back the balance of the inner world. Beneath every cure was the same idea, that sadness was not a punishment, nor a curse, but a weight that could be drained, eased, or lightened through attention and time. And so, in the soft stillness of that ancient world, healing began not with discovery, but with listening. It was a form of faith, not in gods or miracles, but in the body's own quiet desire to return to balance. To live was to sway between humours, between heat and cold, between laughter and stillness. Every person carried within them a small universe of shifting tides, and though centuries have passed, the lesson remains, that calm is not a gift, but a rhythm, one that must be tended one drop, one breath, one quiet moment at a time. The moon's influence. The night sky, to the people of the Middle Ages, was not a distant ceiling, but a living map, vast, alive, and deeply personal. Every star held meaning, every shift of light a quiet message. Among all these celestial bodies, the moon stood closest to human life. It watched over the fields, guided the tides, softened the darkness, and in its rhythm, people believed they could hear the pulse of their own existence. Its phases marked time not just for farmers and travellers, but for healers and thinkers, for those who saw in its changing face the mirror of the human mind. The moon was not only a light in the night, it was an influence, a gentle power that touched thought, sleep, and mood in ways both mysterious and intimate. They said that when the moon was new, the body was quiet, the mind still. But as it began to grow, its brightness stirred invisible currents, the fluids of thought, the hidden waters of emotion. When it became full, everything inside seemed to swell with it. Dreams lengthened, tempers shifted, the sleepless turned restless. Some wandered in the dark, drawn by nothing they could name. Others whispered or sang softly to the air. These moments were not seen as madness, but as tides, natural, predictable, bound to the same rhythm that moved the oceans. The moon's fullness was both beauty and burden, a reminder that even the calmest soul could be pulled by something unseen. In villages where lamps burned low and nights stretched long, people noticed patterns. A child who slept deeply most nights might wake and cry under the full moon. A farmer might grow irritable, his patience shortened. The healer who watched such changes did not look for reasons within the person, but within the sky. The moon, they said, stirred the humours. It warmed the blood, dried the bile, thinned the phlegm. Those with already delicate balance might find themselves shaken, while those, grounded in cold temperament, might simply feel their thoughts quicken. The heavens and the body were bound together, not metaphorically, but materially, as if the same forces that moved the stars also turned the heart. The word lunatic came later, from lunar, moon, but long before the word, the belief existed. To be moon-touched was not yet a stigma. In many places it carried quiet understanding. When a person spoke strangely during bright nights, or seemed lost in reverie, neighbours did not accuse, they waited. They covered windows, dimmed lamps, spoke softly, and let the days pass. When the moon began to wane, so too did the restlessness. To wait for balance was its own form of care. The act of patience, of giving the world time to turn, was as much treatment as any herb or prayer. Some healers recorded the lunar phases beside their patients' conditions. They would note, his melancholy rises with the waxing moon, or her calm returns when the night darkens. Such journals reveal a quiet system of observation, a way of reading the sky as one reads the pulse. The moon's phases became a calendar of emotion. Farmers knew when to plant, healers knew when to soothe. It was not superstition to them, but rhythm, a steady conversation between body and cosmos. They saw the moon not as ruler, but as reflection. What changed above was what stirred below. The connection between light and mind ran deep. They believed moonlight carried a certain coldness, a silvery chill that crept into the body through the eyes and skin. Those who spent too long beneath it were said to lose their warmth, to fall into strange silence. Parents covered the faces of sleeping children when the moon was full, fearing its touch might disturb their dreams. Cattle were brought inside, milk jars turned away from the window. The light, though gentle, was thought to awaken something untamed, not evil, only wild. It was said to call out to what in humans still belonged to the night. Yet there was beauty in this belief. The moon, for them, was a teacher of cycles, of expansion and retreat, of fullness and rest. To understand it was to understand the self. Just as the moon waxed and waned, so did emotion. Joy could rise like light and fade just as softly. Grief could swell and then thin into quiet acceptance. The people who lived under that sky did not fight these changes. They endured them, trusting that calm would return as surely as the moon would darken. Their medicine was patience, their faith was in time. On bright nights, when sleep was difficult, some were encouraged to remain indoors to avoid the silver glow that might stir the mind too deeply. Others were lulled to rest by stories told in low voices. Tales of the moon as guardian, as watcher, as mother of tides. In those stories, the moon was gentle, not fearful. It did not curse or punish, it simply reminded. Its slow movement across the heavens was the same movement within, an eternal rhythm of swelling and release, of emotion, gathering and fading. And still the moon influenced the healers themselves. Some brewed medicines only at certain phases, believing the power of herbs changed with the light. Plants gathered under a waxing moon were thought to hold strength, while those cut under a waning one were gentler, suited for easing sorrow. Water left beneath moonlight was said to calm tremors, cool fevers, or ease troubled sleep. The world itself became an instrument of healing, tuned to celestial rhythm. Even now, in their old notes and fading ink, one can sense the reverence they felt, not for control, but for harmony. To those who lived in that age, the moon was not a symbol of madness, it was a reminder of kinship, that the human mind was made of the same matter as the stars, that our tides and tempers are echoes of a greater rhythm. They did not separate science from wonder. They stood beneath the same sky, feeling its pull, learning to live within its quiet power. And when the moon waned, they waited. The world grew dark again, and balance returned, softly as it always had. The quiet care of the mind. In the small towns of the medieval world, where walls leaned close and streets carried the scent of wood smoke and bread, care did not come from doctors or distant cures. It came from within the home, from quiet understanding, from the slow patience of those who stayed near. When someone began to lose their calm, when their speech turned hesitant, or their eyes grew distant, or sleep no longer came easily, there were no names for it, no words like anxiety or despair. There was only the sense that something inside had gone quiet, or perhaps too loud, that the rhythm of life had shifted out of tune. And so families learned to care not through knowledge but through presence. The house became the first sanctuary. Its walls were narrow, its air still, its light dim from the fire. In that space, care was not announced, but practiced through routine. Meals arrived at the same hour, Voices lowered at night, footsteps softened near the one who needed rest. Sometimes a chair was placed near the door so the person could watch the street, or near the hearth where warmth could ease their stillness. No one asked questions. Questions belonged to scholars and priests, not to families who had only patience to offer. Healing, if it came slowly, through the comfort of repetition. The turning of seasons, the sound of familiar work, the quiet of shared silence. When restlessness grew, when the body could no longer bear its own walls, care turned outward. A walk beyond the village through fields or along rivers was seen as a way to cool the mind. Those who wandered were sometimes accompanied, sometimes left alone to move at their own pace. The motion, the rhythm of steps, the air against the face. These were small medicines, though no one called them that. The return of calm was measured not in days, but in the moment when the shoulders loosened, when breath deepened, when the eyes lifted again toward the horizon. It was not a cure, but a reminder that life continued beyond the room of worry. For others, stillness itself was the remedy. A small corner was set aside, a blanket folded there, a cup of water placed nearby. The one who suffered was not expected to explain. They were left to quiet, not as punishment, but as kindness. Those who cared would move softly around them, tending the house, the animals, the fire. They did not disturb, for they believed the mind could find its own rhythm if given space to breathe. Sometimes the act of being left alone was the truest form of compassion. In these homes, knowledge passed not through books but through gestures. An older woman might brew a tea of mint and valerian, whispering that it would help the heart slow down. A neighbor might bring honey or bread, saying nothing more. No one spoke of illness or healing. They spoke of rest, of balance, of giving time to time. The idea that the mind could break or shatter was unknown. The mind was simply another part of life's cycle, like the fields after harvest, quiet for a while before growing again. To rush it would be to disturb what nature meant to be slow. There were moments, of course, when quiet was not enough, when sadness thickened, when thought turned inward and would not lift. In such times, families still acted from instinct. They brought music, soft and repetitive. They burned herbs that filled the air with steady scents. Sage, rosemary, thyme. They told small stories of ordinary things, of weather, of markets, of births and harvests. Their purpose was not to distract, but to remind, to reconnect the drifting mind to the steady pulse of the everyday. Life, even in its smallest tasks, had a rhythm capable of carrying one through despair, if only for a while. In the evenings, when work was done and the fire settled low, there was a kind of unspoken understanding among those who lived together. Each person, in their own way, carried a small silence, a worry, a longing, a private ache. And so care became mutual. To feed another, to mend a sleeve, to share warmth. These were exchanges of quiet strength. They did not name it as compassion, but it was compassion all the same. They understood, without needing to say it, that peace of mind was not something one achieved, but something one shared, passed from hand to hand like bread. Those who lived in isolation, the widows, the shepherds, the elderly, found their own ways to tend to thought. Some spoke to the wind, some to animals, some to memory. They watched the seasons and learned their lessons, that all things change, that nothing stays still forever, that waiting is its own kind of healing. In time, these small wisdoms became a quiet philosophy, not written, not taught, but lived. To live with one's thoughts was to live with weather, sometimes clear, sometimes dark, always moving. In the absence of science, what remained was observation, And in the absence of medicine, what remained was gentleness. The people of that world knew so little about the mind, and yet perhaps they understood more than they realized. They did not try to fix what could not be named. They only gave it room to breathe. Their care was not grand or perfect, but it was real, made of warmth, of food, of time, of the steady pulse of daily life. And so, in those quiet houses under low roofs and fading firelight, the earliest forms of mental care were born. Not from knowledge, but from instinct, not from treatment, but from tenderness. Every cup poured, every blanket folded, every silence shared was an act of small mercy. The world outside may have been cold and uncertain, but within those walls compassion found a way to exist, soft, ordinary, and unspoken. The monastic chambers. Across the wide countryside, beyond the noise of markets and the smoke of towns, stood the stone buildings that seemed untouched by time. Their walls were thick and cool, their doors heavy, their corridors lined with silence. To those who lived in the world outside, these places were mysteries, quiet sanctuaries where the troubled were sometimes sent, not as punishment, but as retreat. There were no signs or explanations upon the gates, no promises of healing carved into stone. Only stillness. For those who entered, life slowed to the rhythm of breath and bell, of morning light and evening shadow. The world's demands fell away at the threshold, and what remained was the simple practice of existing, hour by hour, in quiet. Inside these chambers, everything was minimal. The rooms were small, with bare walls and little furniture, a narrow bed, a wooden stool, a basin for washing. These were the only companions. Light entered not freely, but gently, filtered through thin slits in the stone. Dust floated in the air like soft snow, moving when the wind passed through the high windows. Meals came through a small opening in the wall, bread, broth, and water, the same each day. There were no questions, no conversations, no judgments. The purpose of this isolation was simple and profound, to let time itself become the healer. The people who came to these chambers were not all the same. Some were sent by families who no longer knew what to do. Some came by choice, seeking quiet after grief or confusion. A few were brought by travelers or local healers who believed that silence and space could settle the mind more effectively than any herb. Once inside, the outside world ceased to matter. Days merged. The sound of the wind through the corridor became a kind of music, the echo of footsteps a reminder that one was still alive. To the modern ear, such solitude might sound cruel. Yet for those who lived it, it was often gentler than the noise they left behind. Time behaved differently there. Without tasks or talk, the hours expanded. Morning light stretched endlessly along the floor, and shadows moved so slowly that their pace became comforting. In the absence of distraction, the smallest things gained weight. The sound of dripping water, the smell of wet stone after rain, the pattern of grain in a wooden wall. Those who stayed learned to notice, and in noticing, they began to think differently. The mind, no longer crowded by voices or expectations, began to move at its own pace. Thoughts that once struck like storms softened into ripples. Worries dissolved into the rhythm of breath. In some chambers, quiet caretakers tended to those who stayed. Older men or women who had long chosen lives of silence. They did not speak much, but their presence was steady, their movements slow and deliberate. They swept the floors, carried food, and sometimes stood by the doorway, simply watching, as if guarding the fragile balance that silence created. They did not offer advice. Their care was in small actions, folding a blanket, refilling a pitcher, adjusting the shutters to let in a measured amount of light. They understood that the mind did not always need words, only gentleness and time. The purpose of these retreats was not to forget the world, but to remember one's place within it. Isolation stripped away what was unnecessary. Without the noise of trade or gossip, the person was left with only the sound of their own thoughts. And at first, that was often the hardest sound to hear. The quiet revealed what had been avoided, fears, regrets, longings. But with enough time, even those grew softer, less sharp. In that slow unwinding, something began to shift. People found new rhythms, waking with the light, resting when darkness returned, feeling the turn of days not as burden, but as pattern. In the evenings, as the air cooled, the world outside the walls grew distant. Sometimes a bell sounded in the distance, long, low, and patient. It did not command, it reminded. Each note carried the same message. Time is passing, and it is kind. The person within the chamber would breathe with that sound, matching its slow rise and fall. The act of listening became a kind of meditation. It did not require belief, only attention. In that attention, calmness grew, not forced, not perfect, but real. There were places where this stillness turned harsh, where solitude became too long, where silence grew heavy rather than light. Not all chambers brought peace. Some only magnified the ache within. Yet even then the world outside saw value in the attempt. Better to wait in silence, they thought, than to be consumed by chaos. And sometimes, even in the loneliest of rooms, something subtle happened. A person began to find meaning in the smallest movements, a shaft of light across the floor, a bird's shadow passing through the window, the sound of rain beginning, then stopping. These moments became markers of time, quiet companions through the long hours. In the gentler houses, those who improved were allowed to walk the gardens. Paths wound through simple courtyards, where herbs grew in neat rows. Rosemary, mint, and sage. The scent filled the air, calming those who walked there. The act of touching the leaves, of feeling texture and breath together, became its own kind of medicine. A few of these gardens were surrounded by walls high enough to block the wind, and within them silence was nearly perfect. Birds sang softly, insects hummed, and the mind followed their pace. The people who walked those paths often did so without aim. There was no goal to reach, no end to the walk, only the act of walking itself. Days passed without pressure and nights without noise. In that rhythm, the mind began to breathe again. Some left after a few weeks, others stayed for years. Most spoke little of what they had experienced. They simply returned to life with slower movements, softer voices, and a certain distance in their eyes. Not detachment, but peace. The chambers had not cured them, not in the way medicine cures illness, but they had given them something rarer, the experience of existing without demand. In time, these stone retreats became symbols of calm. Travelers who passed by would slow their steps when near, as though the silence extended beyond the walls. Some said the air around them felt different, heavier, yet gentle. It carried a patience that seemed to ask nothing and forgive everything. Even now, centuries later, the idea of such stillness carries a strange comfort. The thought that somewhere, long ago, people believed that time and silence could heal the mind, not by force, but by allowing it to rest, is a reminder that healing does not always mean doing. Sometimes it means stopping. Sometimes peace arrives not through treatment, but through the absence of demand. The herbal healers. Beyond the edges of the towns, past the last cobbled streets and out into the wild fields, lived women who spoke a different kind of language. One learned not from books or masters, but from listening. They listened to the wind as it moved through the grass, to the way leaves curled before rain, to the hum of bees around the heads of clover. They listened, too, to the quiet voices of people who came to their doors. These women were called many names: healers, wise women, midwives, sometimes witches, though none of these truly captured what they were. They were keepers of balance, tending to the space between pain and peace, body and spirit, silence and comfort. Their homes were small, built of wood and thatch, their walls lined with jars and bundles of herbs. The air inside was thick with scent, sweet, sharp, earthy. Dried roots hung from the beams. Sprigs of lavender and sage lay in bowls beside the fire. The table was always cluttered, yet everything had its place: mortars, pestles, wooden spoons, pots of oil, bits of cloth, tools of a trade shaped by touch rather than rule. When visitors came, the women moved with slow purpose, grinding, stirring, and pouring without measure, trusting their hands more than their eyes. Their knowledge came not from instruction, but from memory, built over decades of watching what soothed and what did not. Those who came to them did so quietly. There were no appointments or records, no coins exchanged loudly in the market. People arrived at dusk when the fields were dim and the path was soft with dew. They came because they could not sleep, or because sorrow had lingered too long, or because something inside them felt heavy and unspoken. The healer would greet them with a nod, not asking for details, only gesturing toward the chair near the fire. There, in that warm circle of light, the world seemed to slow. The visitor would talk, haltingly at first, about fatigue or worry or a sadness that had no clear cause. The healer would listen, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours, interrupting only to stir the pot or add water to the kettle. Their care was simple, almost invisible. A cup of tea made from chamomile and honey. A cloth soaked in balm and laid gently on the forehead. A few drops of valerian tincture to soften the edge of thought. These were small gestures, yet they carried weight. The herbs themselves were mild, not cures, but companions. They did not erase pain, they made it quieter. The women knew that most suffering could not be chased away, only soothed until it faded on its own. Their role was to keep the body soft enough, warm enough, patient enough to let time do its work. They asked gentle questions, never to diagnose but to understand. When did the sadness begin? Do you sleep through the night? Have you been alone too long? The questions were not tests, only doors through which trust could enter. Most of the time, people found comfort not in the answers, but in being heard. The healer's silence was a kind of medicine. She listened without judgment, her eyes soft, her hands always busy, crushing leaves, tying bundles, straining tea. The sound of her work filled the spaces where words might have failed. Outside, the seasons guided her practice. In spring, she gathered nettles, violets, and primrose. In summer, she dried mint, chamomile, and rose petals. Autumn brought roots, dandelion, burdock, valerian, dug from cool soil. Winter was a time for rest and sorting, for tying herbs into bunches and hanging them above the hearth. Each plant had its rhythm, and so did she. She knew which ones calmed fever, which eased breath, which softened the tightness in a worried chest. But more than that, she understood that the act of care itself, the giving, the making, the sitting together in warmth, carried its own healing power. Some said her teas could make nightmares fade, that her oils could lift the fog from the mind. Others said it was her voice, the way she spoke slowly and low, that did the real work. Whatever the reason, people left her home lighter, They stepped back into the cold air with color in their faces, as though some invisible weight had been set down by the door. Few thanked her directly. Most only nodded, pressed a small token into her hand, and went quietly away. Gratitude, like the herbs themselves, was meant to be subtle, a whisper, not a declaration. The world beyond her door did not always understand her. Some feared her knowledge, calling it unnatural, too close to mystery, yet others depended on it. When a child was restless, when a labor was long, when grief settled like frost upon the heart, they came. They knew she held something no one else could name, the courage to be still in the presence of pain. She did not chase it away, did not cover it with explanation. She simply waited, offering warmth and patience until it softened. That was her art. Through her, the old world learned something profound about healing, that care need not be grand to be powerful. A cup of tea could be an act of mercy. A quiet conversation could be a salve. A single touch, steady and kind, could remind a person that they were still human, still worth tending to. These women, living at the edges of society, carried a wisdom that medicine would later forget, that the body and the mind do not separate, and that both respond best to gentleness. Their remedies did not cure what we now call illness, but they offered something else, a softness in a hard world. They restored a sense of belonging to those who had lost it, gave warmth where words could not reach. In their cottages, lit by small fires, surrounded by the scent of thyme and lavender, people found not just relief, but connection. The quiet realization that care, even in its smallest form, was enough to keep one going. And so, long after the last herb had dried and the last pot had cooled, the memory of their kindness lingered, carried like the faint scent of leaves on the air, gentle, persistent, and enduring.
Strange remedies.
In the centuries when medicine was still more hope than science, the search for calm often took curious forms. The world was full of small experiments, part superstition, part ritual, part quiet desperation. People wanted to understand why sorrow lingered, why rest would not come, why the heart felt heavy for reasons that had no name. And so they turned to what they could touch: stones, feathers, water, and flame. Every texture, every element became a tool for healing. What we now call strange was, in their time, an act of faith in the invisible. Across villages, rumors spread of remedies that could draw sadness out of the body. Some tied the foot of a sparrow to the wrist, believing that when it flew free it carried sorrow with it. Others pressed the wings of owls against their temples, hoping the stillness of night creatures would quiet the mind. There were stories of small animals, frogs, mice, even bats, placed near the head of a sleeper to absorb dark thoughts. When the person woke feeling lighter, they believed the creature had done its work. It was not cruelty, but misunderstanding, born from the belief that melancholy was a physical fog that could be transferred, like breath or scent, from one being to another. Stones, too, carried meaning. Emeralds were ground into fine powder and mixed with wine to steady the nerves. Amethyst was worn around the neck to prevent drunkenness and wandering thought. Smooth river stones were placed on the chest to anchor the heart. Even the weight of a pebble in the hand was thought to help, the coolness of it pulling heat from restless blood. To modern eyes it may seem foolish, but in a world without instruments or explanation, the touch of earth offered a kind of grounding, a reminder that what was heavy within could be balanced by what was still outside. There were rituals for words as well. Some people believed that speaking pain aloud gave it form, and once it had form, it could be moved. They whispered their troubles into the ears of black dogs, then released the animals into the night, trusting that the darkness would carry the words away. Others bent close to rivers, murmuring grief to the moving water. It was said that running streams could wash away sorrow faster than any prayer. These were not acts of madness, but of yearning. Small, symbolic gestures that gave weight to emotion, that turned the invisible into something the hands could shape. Fire held its own kind of comfort. Healers would burn herbs beneath moonlight, rosemary, mugwort, and sage, to cleanse the air of heaviness. The smoke curled through rooms and corridors, twisting like thought itself, leaving behind a faint warmth. People stood quietly and watched, as though the act of burning could consume what ailed them. The smell lingered long after, mingling with the scent of wool and wood smoke. Even the ashes were kept, mixed with oil or wine, and rubbed onto the skin to protect against despair. In that faint glow of ritual, belief became its own medicine. Some treatments bordered on the poetic. Those who feared sleeplessness would wrap themselves in animal fur, believing that the warmth and weight could absorb restlessness. Others lay beneath open skies, letting moonlight touch their faces, claiming it could cool an overheated mind. Certain households hung bundles of garlic above beds, not to ward off spirits, but to draw out bad dreams. Even sound was used, soft humming, the ringing of small bells, the crackle of fire, all reminders that the world still moved, that silence was never truly empty. Every village had its share of curious mixtures. Recipes were passed from grandmother to child, half remembered, half invented. Wine mixed with rose petals for grief. Milk and honey boiled with crushed violet for heartbreak. A coin dipped in water to buy peace from the soul. Nothing was measured, nothing tested, and yet, within the simplicity of these gestures, there was comfort. The making of the remedy was part of its magic, the grinding, stirring, waiting. It gave the hands purpose when the heart had none. Not all experiments were gentle. Some believed that pain itself could drive out sorrow, that by shocking the body, the mind would return to balance. People stood in cold rivers until their limbs went numb. Others struck their feet with nettles to awaken the blood. There were even stories of men sitting before mirrors for hours, staring until they wept, as though tears could wash the spirit clean. The line between ritual and endurance blurred, but beneath it all lay the same desire. To feel alive again, to remind the self that it still existed beneath the weight of thought. Many of these remedies failed, of course, yet their persistence tells another story. In a time without clear answers, imagination became the bridge between suffering and survival. The mind, unable to explain itself, reached outward into nature, into symbol, into act. To tie a feather to one's wrist, to whisper into the dark, to drink powdered stone. These were ways of saying, I am trying. They were small negotiations with the unknown, moments when people gave shape to their confusion and found comfort simply in the doing. Today it is easy to smile at such ideas, to see only the strangeness, but if one looks closely, beneath the absurdity lies tenderness, a deep human need to touch the unseen, to make meaning from pain. These old rituals, however strange, were acts of courage in their own quiet way. They spoke of hope in a language of gesture, of trust placed in the simple things, in the coolness of stone, the warmth of fur, the whisper of wind, the turning of moonlight on the skin. In those gestures lived the first truth of healing, that even when understanding fails, the heart will keep searching for ways to begin again. The accepted outsiders. Every village, no matter how small, had one, a wanderer, a quiet figure who drifted through streets and fields with an air of distance. They might be seen at dawn, standing near the well, or at dusk, sitting by the path with eyes lost somewhere far beyond the horizon. They were the ones who spoke softly to themselves, who paused to listen to voices no one else could hear, who laughed or wept for reasons that had no name. Yet in many places these people were not cast out. They were part of the landscape, as familiar as the church bell, the market noise, or the wind moving through the wheat. Their difference was visible, but it did not always bring fear. It brought recognition, a quiet understanding that the mind could stretch beyond the ordinary, and that some simply lived closer to that edge. They were called by many names: dreamers, holy fools, touched ones, or simply Old Will or Mad Meg. No one quite knew where they came from or when they began to wander. Some had once been farmers, mothers, or craftsmen. Others seemed to appear from nowhere, carrying only a bundle, a stick, and a slow step. The village watched them come and go, not as intruders, but as distant kin. They were not hidden away, nor entirely embraced, simply allowed to exist in the spaces between. When the days were warm, they slept beneath trees. In winter, they found corners of barns or the kindness of a kitchen fire. Someone would leave a crust of bread, another a blanket, another only a glance of quiet sympathy. Care did not always arrive with words. Sometimes it was as simple as not turning one's face away. The presence of these outsiders gave rhythm to life. Children whispered stories about them, half afraid, half curious. Elders nodded when they passed, as though acknowledging something inevitable. On market days they might stand at the edge of the crowd, murmuring softly, unseen but always there, reminders that sanity, like weather, could shift with the seasons. Their wandering was not a disruption, it was a part of the world's breathing. They walked the same paths each year, knew which houses would offer food, which doors would stay shut, which dogs would bark, and which would not. In this way, they belonged, even if they did not fit. Some were treated with gentle pity. A woman who spoke to birds might be called strange, but if she harmed no one, she was left in peace. A man who muttered prayers to the sky might be thought of as blessed, even if his words made no sense. People would cross themselves when they saw him, not out of fear, but out of habit, as though marking a line between worlds. A few believed these wanderers carried wisdom, that their strangeness was a kind of insight. They said madness opened doors the rest of the world could not see, and so sometimes they were approached for advice, or simply listened to, as one might listen to the wind, not for clarity, but for calm. In quieter villages, the outsider became a familiar soul. Someone might leave food by the door each morning. Another would patch a cloak or offer shoes before winter. In return, the wanderer might sweep the street, feed the animals, or help carry water. Their gestures were small but steady, forming a silent pact of coexistence. The villagers did not ask where the person slept or what thoughts haunted them. They simply accepted that some lives moved differently. Compassion in that world was not an emotion, but a habit, the quiet allowance of another's difference. There were times, of course, when patience ran thin. When storms lasted too long or food grew scarce, tolerance faltered. A sudden outburst, a strange laugh at the wrong moment, could turn kindness into distance. The same voices that once whispered sympathy could whisper fear. Yet even then the rejection was rarely complete. After anger came regret. After suspicion, forgiveness. Someone would remember the outsider's face, pale, tired, human, and bring them back bread the next morning. In their world, Survival depended on one another, and even the outcast had a place in that fragile web. The wanderers themselves seemed to understand their role. They did not fight against being different. They walked with a kind of quiet dignity, neither proud nor ashamed. Their minds moved through unseen landscapes, but their bodies followed familiar paths, from the mill to the river, from the woods to the town square. They spoke to animals, to stones, to ghosts of memory. They hummed old songs or recited fragments of prayer. To the villagers their words made no sense, yet sometimes in their nonsense a kind of truth emerged. They might point to the clouds and say it would rain, and it did, or they might whisper of death before it came. Whether by chance or intuition, the village began to listen, if only a little. In the rhythm of rural life, their existence served a quiet purpose. They reminded others of humility, that sanity was not a possession, but a balance easily tipped. They reminded people to be gentle, to soften their judgment. To see them was to confront mystery, to accept that not all human minds could be measured or mended. In a world without doctors for the soul, such understanding was its own form of wisdom. To let someone be without naming or fixing them was a rare act of grace. As the years passed, these figures aged alongside the villages. Their hair turned white, their pace slowed, but their presence remained steady. Some died unnoticed in barns or fields, buried quietly by the hands of those who once fed them. Others simply vanished, their paths ending somewhere beyond the forest's edge. But their memory lingered, not as tragedy, but as gentleness. People would point to a worn path or an empty chair and say softly, "That was where she used to sit." In that memory lived a kind of peace, proof that even in a harsh world there had always been room for those who did not fit its shape. The accepted outsiders, the dreamers, the wanderers, the quiet ones, belonged to no one, and yet to everyone. They walked the thin line between the familiar and the unknown, reminding the world that difference did not always need a cure. Their lives, though fragile, carried an unspoken lesson, that the mind, in all its forms, is still part of the same vast human field. And in the patience of those who watched over them, the Middle Ages revealed something modern life often forgets, that understanding does not always require comprehension, and that kindness can live quietly, without a name, in the simple act of letting another soul be free. Melancholy and stillness. In the slow breathing of the medieval world, there existed a word that carried both sorrow and beauty: melancholy. It was not seen as madness nor as sin, but as a kind of deep fatigue, a shadow that moved quietly through the soul. It came upon those who worked too long in stillness, who looked each day upon the same grey horizon, who carried too many unspoken thoughts within. It was not a sudden illness, but a slow settling, like dust on untouched shelves or fog over water. The people of that age understood it not as punishment, but as imbalance, the heavy side of the human temperament that could not always stay bright. To be melancholic was to live at the edge of silence, where thought grew thick and time seemed to slow its turning. They believed this stillness of the heart came when the black bile rose too high, that ancient humour tied to the element of earth, cool and dry. It was said to weigh down the spirit, to make the blood sluggish and the eyes reflective. Those who lived under its influence were not shunned. They were often seen as thoughtful, poetic, or wise. A melancholic person might sit for hours by a window, unmoving, their mind travelling far beyond what the eye could see. They might speak little, but when they did, Their words carried the quiet gravity of someone who had listened long to the world's slower rhythms. The village knew these people, recognized them not as broken but as different, softer, inward, patient. The remedies for melancholy were not forceful. No one expected a sudden return to joy. The goal was not to chase away the shadow, but to walk alongside it until it lightened on its own. Gentle work was often prescribed, tasks that required the hands but not the mind, weaving, tending gardens, shaping clay, mending nets. The repetition of small actions was seen as medicine, not because it fixed the sorrow, but because it gave it rhythm. Through motion, through the steady pulse of daily effort, the body reminded the spirit that it still belonged to the living world. In that quiet labor, a person found order again, and within order, a kind of peace. Those who tended to the melancholic, healers, family, or quiet friends, knew that noise or insistence would only deepen the stillness. They created structure instead, light in the morning, warmth at midday, silence in the evening. Meals were simple and regular, never rushed. The melancholic was encouraged to walk beneath open air, to watch the turning of the sky, to feel wind and distance. The horizon, they said, could draw the mind outward when it had curled too tightly inward. Even a single moment of noticing, the flight of a bird, the shift of cloud, the glimmer of water, could ease the inward pull of sadness. Nature was both mirror and balm, still patient and endlessly forgiving. There were those who saw melancholy not as affliction, but as temperament, a necessary depth in the human design. To feel its weight was to know the quiet parts of the soul. The melancholic saw the world differently. They noticed decay and beauty together, the softness in sorrow, the way silence could hold meaning. Their slowness was not always weakness. Sometimes it was grace, the ability to sit with what others hurried past. In monasteries, such souls were often given work that suited their nature, copying texts, tending gardens, observing stars. The discipline of repetition soothed them, the predictability of days offering shelter from the chaos of thought. Still, melancholy could grow heavy if left unattended. When the shadow deepened, when food lost its taste and sleep its rest, gentle hands intervened. A healer might prescribe bitter herbs to warm the blood, music to stir the breath, conversation to remind the sufferer of sound. Friends might visit not to cure, but to share presence, to sit beside the silent one, to offer bread and stay a while. The act of companionship, even wordless, was a quiet declaration. You are not forgotten. It was perhaps the most powerful treatment they knew. For many, recovery was not a single event, but a slow awakening. The first sign of healing was not laughter, but motion, a hand reaching for work, eyes lifting to light, a faint return of appetite. The melancholic would begin to move again, to walk, to mend, to hum. These gestures, though small, carried immense meaning. They showed that the rhythm of the world had entered once more into the rhythm of the self. Balance, once disturbed, returned not through will, but through time. Even philosophers of the age spoke of melancholy with reverence. They said that those touched by it walked nearest to truth, for they saw both the beauty and the sorrow of existence in equal measure. Some believed it to be the price of deep understanding, that to see the world clearly was to bear its weight. Artists, writers, and mystics carried this quiet heaviness, transforming it into creation, into reflection, into prayer. Their sadness became a bridge between solitude and expression, between silence and meaning. In this way, melancholy was not merely endured, but accepted, even honored. It taught patience, empathy, and stillness. It reminded people that healing was not always a return to joy, but a reconciliation with quiet. Those who lived through it often emerged gentler, slower to anger, quicker to notice the small mercies of the day, a cup of warm broth, a beam of sunlight, the sound of rain against a window. They learned to find calm, not in escape, but in acceptance. And so, within the slow heart of that old world, melancholy became both ailment and teacher. It showed that the mind does not heal through force, but through rhythm, through the slow return of order where chaos once lingered, to rise with the morning light, to work with steady hands, to walk beneath an open sky. These were the true medicines. Not to cure sorrow, but to soften it until it became part of the body's own quiet song. And in that song, in that measured stillness, life continued, not untouched by pain, but carried gently by the rhythm that never truly stopped. The meaning of joy. In the slow rhythm of the Middle Ages, joy was not something chased, but something found, quietly, briefly, like sunlight slipping through the clouds. It did not arrive as laughter bursting from the heart, nor as celebration without end. It came in small, steady ways, in the warmth of bread shared among neighbors, in the music of a lute echoing through a courtyard, in a child's voice breaking the silence of morning. The people of that world did not speak of happiness as we do now. They spoke of balance, of rightness, of the soul sitting comfortably within its place. Joy to them was not the opposite of sorrow, but its companion, a soft flicker in the same fire. Festivals were rare, yet when they came, they unfolded like breath, long held and finally released. The entire village gathered in the square, dressed in whatever color they could find. There was music, slow at first, then faster, and dancing that turned strangers into companions, if only for a night. The air filled with the smell of bread, roasted meat, and smoke. For those few hours, life felt larger. Worries faded and people remembered what it was to belong. But even joy was measured. Too much laughter, they said, could invite misfortune, for excess broke the delicate order of the world. Moderation was the quiet rule of their lives, enough to feel alive, but never enough to lose control. Laughter itself was treated with care. It was welcome near the fire, gentle and brief, shared like bread before sleep. But loud laughter, wild and unstoppable, was considered dangerous, a sign of unbalanced spirit, of joy tipping toward madness. The villagers understood that the mind was fragile, that every emotion held both light and shadow. To laugh without measure was to invite chaos, to feel without pause was to risk being consumed. And so they practiced restraint, not out of fear, but from respect for the unseen forces that shaped them. Grace was found in balance, a laughter that knew when to fade, a smile that did not linger too long. For most, joy lived in routine. It was not a peak, but a rhythm. To wake before dawn, to walk through the mist, to feel the chill lift with the first light. This was a quiet joy. To complete one's work, to see the field tilled or the bread baked, to hear the evening bell, that was contentment. Their joy was built not from indulgence, but from repetition, from the knowledge that life could continue without sudden loss. To eat, to rest, to wake again, these were the rituals that steadied the mind. The people did not name it mental health, but they understood its shape. Stability was their happiness, predictability their peace. The seasons themselves gave structure to feeling. Spring brought relief, the scent of thawed earth, the first buds of color. Summer was labor and light. Autumn, the soft melancholy of completion. Winter, silence and survival. Each had its rhythm, and to live well was to move with it, to change without resistance, to accept both warmth and cold. They knew joy was not constant, that it came and went like weather. To chase it would be foolish, to receive it, wise. When it came, even briefly, it was met with gratitude. A pause in work, a sigh, a moment of stillness. Music was one of the few languages that carried joy without danger. A single flute, a drum, a voice humming through the dark. These sounds softened the edges of the day. Musicians did not play to impress, but to remind of the body's pulse, of the shared rhythm of life. In taverns and small gatherings, songs rose not to celebrate, but to hold the night together. The melody wrapped around the people like a shared blanket, simple and human. When the final note faded, silence returned without sorrow. That too was part of the balance, knowing when to stop. Joy was not always light. Sometimes it appeared in moments of endurance, in surviving a long winter, in bringing home a full harvest, in mending what was broken. There was a kind of sacredness in perseverance. The people found joy in their own resilience, in the proof that they could continue. This quiet pride did not announce itself. It lived in posture, in the soft look exchanged between workers at the end of a long day. A shared nod, a shared meal. That was enough. Their joy did not need to shout to be real. Even the church bells, though tied to faith, carried a deeper rhythm, one of continuity. The sound marked the passing hours, giving shape to time. Each toll was a reminder: morning, noon, evening, rest. The villagers followed that rhythm not as obligation but as comfort. The regularity itself was a kind of mercy. In the ringing of the bell they found assurance that the world, despite its hardships, still held order. The mind, when it faltered, could rest within that order. Balance, once again, was the foundation of peace. For those who had known sorrow, joy was not a return to innocence, but a quiet reconciliation. It was the ability to smile again, not as denial, but as endurance. They understood that joy did not erase pain. It grew beside it like grass through stone. To find joy after loss was to trust life again, even knowing it could wound. This was the wisdom of their time, that light and darkness were not enemies, but necessary halves of the same whole. One could not exist without the other. And so in the slow heart of the Middle Ages, joy was not a pursuit, but a practice, a steady keeping of balance in the face of change. To live well was to live evenly, to laugh without excess, to grieve without collapse, to work with care, and to rest with gratitude. They may not have had the words for mental health, yet they lived by its oldest truth, that the mind, like the seasons, endures through rhythm. In the quiet between laughter and labor, between noise and stillness, they found the grace that we still seek. Not endless joy, but the calm art of continuing. The early light of understanding. As the long night of the Middle Ages began to lift, a faint light of reason spread across Europe, not sudden, not blinding, but soft and gradual, like dawn touching the edges of old stone walls. For centuries, people had looked at the mind through the language of faith, spirit, and imbalance, but now new ideas drifted in, carried by translations of forgotten texts, by travelers returning from distant lands, by scholars who dared to read and wonder. From the ancient Greeks and the physicians of the Arab world came whispers of observation, of the body as a system, of the mind as part of that same living order. The world was beginning to look inward again, not to condemn, but to understand. In certain cities, Florence, Paris, Cordoba, Small rooms of study became the seeds of a new medicine. Scholars gathered under candlelight to copy, translate, and debate. They spoke of humours still, but also of organs, of air, of diet, of environment. They believed the body and mind could influence one another in delicate ways, and that healing required harmony between them. It was not yet science as we know it, but it was movement, the slow turning of thought toward gentleness, toward clarity. The idea that sadness or madness might not be sin, but sickness, began to take root. Compassion, once hidden behind ritual, began to show its face in reason. In some places, new kinds of houses appeared, small, quiet buildings with gardens and sunlight. They were not grand hospitals, but sanctuaries where the troubled could rest rather than be feared. The air was different there. Windows were opened to let in light. Courtyards grew herbs whose scent calmed the breath. Music drifted softly through halls. Water moved in fountains, steady and constant. The people within were encouraged to walk, to breathe, to sit in silence beneath trees. These gestures were simple but revolutionary. For the first time, stillness was not a cage, it was a cure. Healers began to notice what had long been invisible, that the mind could change when treated with kindness. They observed that fresh air soothed agitation, that quiet lessened fear, that routine restored appetite. They saw that people needed more than survival, they needed gentleness. And so their methods changed. Bloodletting grew rarer, replaced by rest and rhythm. The heavy chains of superstition loosened, replaced by the quiet structure of care. Patients were not locked away, but tended to, spoken with, and, for the first time, listened to. The act of listening itself became medicine. This new way of seeing did not erase the old beliefs entirely. Faith still lingered in every corner, but it began to live alongside reason instead of against it. A physician might still pray, but he also kept notes, observed patterns, and tested remedies. A monk might still chant, but he also brewed calming teas, tended gardens, and learned the language of herbs. Slowly, a bridge formed between the mystical and the practical, between soul and body, between fear and understanding. It was fragile, but real. The change was not only in the mind of the healer, but in the heart of society. Where once those who suffered were hidden, now they were beginning to be seen. Their presence no longer threatened order, it called for compassion. The poorhouses and monastic infirmaries that dotted the countryside began to open their doors to the troubled of mind. Some failed, some flourished, but the gesture itself mattered. For the first time, care was an act of recognition. To suffer mentally was to remain human, deserving not punishment, but patience. In the writings of scholars like Avicenna and Galen, translated anew into Latin, physicians found words that reshaped their craft. They spoke of observation, of moderation, of treating not the symptom, but the whole person. These texts, copied by hand in dim rooms, spread slowly but steadily. They brought with them a sense of humility, as the idea that understanding the body and mind was not an act of power, but of service. To heal meant to accompany nature, not to command it. That lesson changed everything. The people of that time began to think differently about suffering itself. It was no longer seen only as divine punishment, but as part of human existence. Something to be eased, not endured in silence. The old rituals of fear began to fade, replaced by gentler forms of care. Families were encouraged to tend to their loved ones with rest, clean air, and structure. Isolation became less common. The language of possession slowly turned into the language of condition. It was a quiet revolution, not shouted from pulpits, but whispered through the hands of those who healed. Even the design of buildings began to reflect this change. Where once stone walls stood heavy and dark, now windows opened to gardens. Sound mattered, the rustle of trees, the soft flow of water. Colour mattered, pale walls, bright linens, green courtyards. The architecture of care evolved to reflect a growing truth, that peace came not from confinement, but from connection to the natural world. Healing, they discovered, required light, and so by the late 15th century, the idea of the mind had begun to transform. It was no longer a battlefield between sin and salvation, but a living part of the body, capable of imbalance and renewal. The healers of that age did not yet have the words we use now, not depression, not anxiety, not trauma, but they had begun to see that the mind, like the body, could falter and mend. They had begun to believe that gentleness could heal. The dawn of understanding had arrived, faint, imperfect, but unmistakable. And with it came a lesson that still endures, that every human being, in struggle or in calm, is worthy not of fear, but of patience. Night returns again, soft and unhurried, folding itself over the old world like a dark, familiar cloak. The air moves gently above the fields where no one walks now, over the stone paths that once carried footsteps and quiet prayers. The houses are long gone, their lights extinguished, yet the silence that remains feels alive. A calm that belongs not to the earth or the sky, but to the space between. It is the same silence that once filled the chambers of healers, the same stillness that gathered around the beds of the sleepless, the same breath that has moved through centuries of searching minds. The voices of those who came before us have faded into that rhythm, the steady, endless pulse of a world that has always been trying to understand itself. Every age, every heart has reached for the same fragile balance, to make sense of thought, to soothe pain without losing meaning. The people of the Middle Ages did not speak of anxiety or depression, did not name their shadows as we do now, yet they knew their shape. They felt the weight of restlessness, the pull of sorrow, the trembling between fear and calm. They did not have our words, but they had our hearts. The same longing to find peace within the noise of being alive. In their ways, however rough or strange, there was tenderness. Through blood and breath, through herbs and prayer, through the waiting of time itself, they searched for something we still search for. Quietness, the easing of the storm within. Their remedies may seem distant now, the cutting of skin, the whisper to animals, the burning of herbs beneath the moon. But beneath each act was the same truth that guides us still, that to heal is to listen, and to listen is to love. As the centuries turned, the search did not end. It simply changed shape, as all human things do. The chambers became hospitals, the healers became doctors, the rituals became medicine. But the essence, that slow, patient desire to be whole, remained. Even now, when we speak of balance, of recovery, of the mind's rest, we are echoing their old wish to live with ourselves gently, to find peace, not in perfection, but in rhythm. Now the night deepens and the world exhales. Somewhere, far beyond the noise of time, the same quiet breath continues. The sound of minds learning, failing, healing, and dreaming. There are no treatments here, no cures, only stillness. Only the timeless truth that to be human is to seek balance again and again, across every century, across every heartbeat. And as the stars begin to fade, as the last echoes of their voices dissolve into the air, the mind settles, not in knowledge but in peace. The long search for understanding rests for a while, and in that rest, the world finally sleeps.